Welcome to CivilNet. This is your host, Hacopian, and we are very honored and very pleased to have our favorite guest of all time, Professor Georgi Derlugian, here with us to do a year-end review of 2021 and what a year it has been. Welcome to our program.
Always a pleasure.
Let's start off with a simple question. What is it that happened this year, during this last 12 months, that surprised you? What didn't happen that surprised you? And what I mean by that is in totality, not simply in politics. I'm talking about politics, economics, geopolitical issues. What is it that you were expecting at the beginning of the year that didn't happen, and what were you not expecting that did happen?
Let's start with serious thing first, because probably this is what people expect from us. The biggest surprise is that nothing actually happened. Neither in the world nor at the local level. The continuation of the same processes. That in the United States, there was a change of regime, but it was really not a regime change. It was change of more or less of the same morass, with now different faces. There are new dangers lurking. As you saw probably in the Washington Post, American generals discuss very seriously their worry about a coup. It's a misnomer, it's not a coup. It's actually a civil war. What would happen if different branches of whatever, United States Armed Forces, National Guard, take different sides in a contested election like it happened in January. This is astonishing, frightening, but it didn't happen yet. And we hope it might not happen. So the whole intent of these generals is that it wouldn't happen. In Russia, there were expectations that the incredible return of Mr. Navalny, who was poisoned, who identified, he claims, the agents of Russian security services, who poisoned him, who actually called him on the telephone. That was all very spectacular. And that prepared a very spectacular return to Russia and the protests in case that he is arrested. Those protests were beaten back. And Mr. Navalny is in prison and semi-forgotten, and not much has happened there. And in Artsakh and in Armenia, more or less the same, continued. So we are in the aftermath of war. Although disaster was averted, of course, the biggest surprise is that for all the trump cards and the opportunities that whatever opposition had in Armenia, they spectacularly failed to capitalize on that. They gained a good foothold in the parliament. It's serious, 20%, honestly verified. So what was actually surprising about this election, not only that Nikol Pashinyan's party won, that it was not contested. It's probably the first time in Armenian history, I think.
Second time since 2018. Mm-hmm. But the first one, December 2018, was not contested.
It was clear, what happened. And what else should I could mention at the personal level, that after COVID, a year ago, my wife dragged me, to see a cardiologist, with a wonderful dear name, Aida Georgievna. Thank you very much, Aida Georgievna, who determined that I probably, should have a small surgery, just for arrhythmia. It was very well done. I met Armenian medical profession up close. The nurses are humorous and just wonderful, very caring women. So this is really healthcare. And that was the eye-opener, actually, that they're quite well equipped. What can I tell you about, situation in Armenia? There is no 20th century medicine here. There is 19th century. It's mostly in villages and in some parts of downtown Yerevan, kind of old-style doctors, with big noses, speaking even French. And then there is 21st century, and that's really at the world level, so there is something which is working very nicely, and there is nothing to report about it, and that's why, we don't read this health news, everything is about geopolitics or domestic politics, where everything is bad.
Well, I mean, there's actually, well, with you, what's fantastic is the political always meets the personal, but in a smart way. And yes, I think there's people miss the ordinary things here. That they miss things in the economy. They miss the job, the staffing shortages, things that would be somewhat surprising to people who are looking at this country from the outside. I want to move to a more cultural, social question, and this is an issue that was brought up by Ruben Vartanian. He put this in a critical manner. He said that he was disappointed, he was taken aback by the culture of Armenia, in the sense that during the war, our coffee shops were full. There's a border crisis, every restaurant is full. And there's this complete disconnect between the geopolitical realities of the country and the threats that it faces, and the way people react to it. In some ways, Armenia's business has become business. It's about making money and living your life no matter what happens. So this is a sociological question. Is Mr. Vartanian correct, or is he not correct? And is this a coping mechanism for a people under stress? Or is it some kind of a resilience that nothing will fade us? Or is it just irresponsible putting your collective heads in the sand? How do you respond to his challenge and what we think this kind of atmosphere comes out of?
These are all very good research questions to which we can venture hypotheses. So this is how, I always lecture on this, my students, how any good article, funding proposal, should be structured. You must have a good question, and the question must have an unevident answer. If it is evident, why have research? Although, of course, I assure you, lots of people are doing exactly that in academia. So Ruben Vartanian managed to formulate sharp, very important questions with the potential answers that are not evident. Second, you come up with a potential explanation. That's called hypothesis otherwise. The next question would be, are you the first so smart? No, there are these people who did this in other countries and other contexts. This is called literature reviews. Bibliography. This is what was done in the field. And finally, how do you know? It's called methodology. Because I polled, I collected this data because and this is an invitation to research. I hope it gets funded. It's important research. So we are discussing hypotheses so far only. And let me notice, that October 1917, the day after Bolsheviks took power in Petrograd and called it Great October Socialist Revolution, it becomes, this mythical, legendary date. The newspapers in Petrograd in the morning reported, that there was a disruption to the traffic of city tram because of a broken wire. That new rubber galoshes were delivered, to a shop of such and such, and Dr. blah, 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 it was paid advertisement, evidently it was on front page of newspapers, received a new breakthrough treatment for syphilis, which was apparently, a big concern at the turn of the 20th century. And then, only then, there was something about, and Bolsheviks claimed that they took power from provisional government. And then after that, actually very substantive theater reviews, that Shalappin is sitting there, Stravinsky is doing that, Rachmaninoff, and so culture was at a high point. This is typical, actually, that people who survived the civil war in the Lebanon would know, for instance, that at some point, bullets are flying, just around the corner, but people are sipping coffee because some of the wheels are going on as normal. Is it good or bad? if we remember, the concern, and do you remember, in say November, December 2001, after 9/11 in the United States, so many people were afraid of going out, that we had to urge them, that the chance of being hit in a terrorist attack is much less than being hit by a cab driver. That please go out, let's restart the economy. So there is something normal in that. What do you expect, that the whole country would be in mourning? There was a lot of mourning at the same time. However, there is something frivolous in much of that behavior. I do agree, that there is a disconnect with certain reality, but this is not, geopolitics is not the reality that humans are dealing in their daily life or should be dealing, unless even if they are living right at the border in villages, which are now under the sights of Azerbaijani soldiers. There should be governments dealing with that. So what Ruben Vartanian really underlines is the need for a competent government whose job is to deal with these kind of issues, so that the rest of society, if they can afford it, should go to cafes. And even if they cannot afford, the government should be concerned with how they could afford it.
Yeah. I'm going to move on to two Russia-related questions, because I know you know that country well. And there's obviously, there's this big date coming, heading our way, and everyone knows that when the November 9th agreement was signed, there was an element in there that said the Russian peacekeeping presence, because it is not formalized by some international mandate or by the UN, that both countries have a chance to essentially ask the Russians to leave if it's done 6 months beforehand. There's some provision in that agreement. So obviously many people are concerned. This is obviously not going to be done by the Armenian side, because the Armenian side has the incentive to have the Russian peacekeepers stay there. So the issue is, what happens in 5 years? And we need to put this in context. Obviously, this was a poison pill that was placed there by Aliyev, because it creates uncertainty in Armenia, it creates uncertainty in Artsakh, and has this element of terror in it. However, as you know, in politics, the best laid traps are usually the ones you lay for yourself. Because now you have opposition who's pressing him, saying, let's finish ethnic cleansing, let's finish this genocidal ethnic cleansing process. And he is going to be the one who is going to look soft if he doesn't. Or he can simply ignore this date. And then there's the overall political reality of this region, which historically, when outside of state collapse, when the Russians or the Soviets in a period, when they come, they don't leave. So the expectation realistically is that this current setup and the Russian presence is going to stay, because no one's going to dare to really ask them to leave. What do you see coming our way in 5 years? What are the multiple scenarios? And what do you expect to happen in 5 years? What do you expect Aliyev to do when that time comes?
Let me say what, if I were a journalist, I would have never said. But as a sociologist, I probably can afford to say, I always marvel at how much effort and ink is spent on discussing non-issues, while there are much more pressing and important issues. That this 5-year term is a non-issue in my view. It will become an inevitable disaster if something happens disastrous with Russia. If Russia preserves itself, and if Russia continues to be at least a regional power, there is no way, as you said, that this could happen. And let me point out, that there are 3 things about the last year war. One of them is totally clear. The other is reasonably clear. The third is totally unclear. Why did this war happen is totally clear. It was going to happen, so the question might be only about timing, so why it didn't happen earlier, what might have happened, what would be the outcome had it happened slightly later. But it happened when it happened. So the second, which is more of an issue, why did it last that long? On the one side, there was no blitzkrieg, because Armenian defenders managed to put up serious resistance. And the seriousness of that resistance is more apparent than. The problem is that the Ministry of Defense in their briefing, Armenian Ministry of Defense, were supplying a lot of over-optimistic data, probably, misinformation, and this is why, this actually, harms analyzing the picture in more sober terms. But on a sober account, this was a very serious fight. It's actually probably the most serious conventional war of 21st century so far. God forbid, that something worse happens. But there is the third and biggest unknown. Why did it end? What happened on the 9th and 10th of November? So that mystery, there was some kind of a crowbar brought into this. It was not an Armenian crowbar, so it was not Western, it must have been Russian. So what was said, done, threatened, promised? We don't know, and we might never know, actually, but that was something very potent. Second very important thing, you have to realize about Artsakh, that this is a game, but not the game of badminton. It's more like game of, imagine backgammon, where 10 dice are being used, zar. And in the meantime, all players are keeping a crowbar or a brick next to themselves. So we don't know exactly what is going to happen in Turkey, but it's not going to look pretty. We know this, so it's a separate conversation, but Turkey is heading towards disaster. How bad, how soon is always difficult to predict. Like in social science, the most difficult thing is not the prediction in itself, is predicting the intensity and exact date. Like if I predict to you that next year in January it will snow in Lori, big deal. But if I predicted, that on the 13th of January it will snow with 2 inches, that would be preposterous. Right, so this is the same thing, we don't know what's going to happen in Turkey. Russia is definitely going into some kind of transition. Now it's quite obvious that America is going into a very life-threatening transition, probably, because that political system is out of sync. President Biden tried to bring it back to the 1970s, kind of moderate centrism in both foreign and domestic policy, into containment and detente at the same time. It doesn't seem working, so what is going to happen there? European Union is going through another very difficult transition. So they lost Britain, but can they act now? Actually they might be more active suddenly. So then there is Iran, there is Israel, there are United Arab Emirates, and there are so many dice coming out. But to imagine that everything will align in the favor of Azerbaijan is just a probability that is not within the range of calculable.
Let's move on to a related question, and I'm glad you brought up Turkey. There's what I call the Russia-Turkey question. Anybody who watches them, if you're the average person, it's like hearing cats. You don't know if they're fighting or making love, because there's all these contradictory back and forths. But from what you know from your Russian sources, reading, conversations, how comfortable is Russia by the fact that the Turks have carved themselves a role in the Caucasus? Do they understand that, for example, the Turkish victory in Artsakh last year was actually a Russian defeat? Or, given that the fact that everyone knows that the country is heading towards a political crisis or an economic crisis, they're going to take their time and let nature take its course as Turkey, again, marginalizes itself into a far less power that's far less ambitious because it frankly cannot afford those ambitions economically. What is the Russian view of Turkey?
This is a question about the Loch Ness monster. So many people claim that they saw the monster in the lake. Very sophisticated technology was used to detect the monster, and nothing. So what can we do? We have to reason about it and reason about the environment. So think about the monster in these terms, that if it is a very big animal, if it is an emanation of unknown kind of energy from another universe, and then we know nothing. We have never seen these emanations. But if it is a dinosaur or a big fish or whatever, we know two things for sure immediately: that it's not alone because it must breed. There is papa monster, mama monster, baby monster. And second, they eat something once in a while. So the third question is, what is there to be eaten in Loch Ness? Not much, and therefore the question is not about the existence of the monsters, but the question is in social psychology. Why do people see them? With the Russian-Turkish so-called alliance, pay attention to the origins of both Mr. Erdogan and Putin. In a sense, they're actually amazingly parallel, just like the histories of Russia and Turkey over the last 500 years. That's a separate conversation. They are sometimes amazingly parallel, but in, say, World War I, both had a disaster. The result was genocidal class warfare in Russian Empire and downright genocide in Turkey. In one case, Ataturk emerges and builds the country on nationalist foundations, something basically around the army. In another case, much more ambitious Stalin builds up the country far more to a superpower, and not around an army, but around secret police and mass party. By the 1980s, both models are in trouble, because there are more and more people domestically asking, so what did you really promise? What did you deliver? There are many young people, young leftists, let's put it this way, in both places. And out of this mess, two leaders emerge. So the 1990s are quite painful, more painful for Russians. Out of this mess emerged the leader, Erdogan and Putin, who promised to bring the countries where? Remember, Erdogan was very pro-European. Remember that Putin, in his first term, was very pro. Everybody cheered. He's not only sober and lean and mean, but he speaks fluent German.
He green-lighted the U.S. presence in Central Asia and Afghanistan.
Exactly, so he tried. Then the European Union negotiations with Turkey stall. NATO starts expanding at Russia's expense, and both leaders, turn inwards. And at some point, they realize that actually their survival and survival of their projects, and they're very ambitious, both of them, is in defying the West. So have that. So this is what they have in common. So that they two of the biggest rock states. So the really rock state is China, but China is so big that for now almost 3 decades, nobody in the West would dare call it rock, because then you have to do something about it. With these, the two countries, you could for a while, but they go on what appeared up to a point very successful expansion. So in 2011, let me remind you, Arab Spring revolts destroyed the Arab dictatorships across the Middle East. Who was coming in the stead of Saddam Hussein? Erdogan. Erdogan, with his kind of democracy, he promised democratization. In the West, many people applauded. Here is an Islamist who is a liberal Democrat at the same time, who is really, and he is genuinely pro-capitalist. He's about entrepreneurship for his people. Of course, he's about pork barrel politics. He's very much like Chicago mayor. But and he was building up in not Ottoman Empire. He was building into everything. So if he could build his influence in Central Asia, it could not be called Neo-Ottoman because Ottomans had never been present there. So let's call it Turkic. If we can build it somewhere else, we will find a name for it. So the problem was building influence. Building diaspora. Let me remind you, there is a huge Turkish diaspora in Western Europe, not only in Germany. So let's build up everywhere. And then 2015, on the cusp of victory. First, Erdogan is losing his gamble in Egypt, mostly because of Egyptian military supported by Saudis and Emiratis. And then Russian airplanes appear in Syria and prevent, they change the outcome of civil war. What would be Erdogan's feelings towards Russians? Just imagine. So just like with the Loch Ness Monster, don't ask Erdogan, don't ask the loyalists around him, don't ask the Russians. So what should be their feelings? And at the same time, Russia is fighting today to create sort of a barrier of state. It's not really a Russian empire any longer, because some people in the 1990s thought that with the collapse of Soviet Union, Russia is so much bigger, it's so central. Everybody speaks Russian, so we will continue to dominate the former republics. Just by default, they will have to come shopping here. That didn't happen. And now Russia is actually scaling down, they just want a sort of Finland around themselves. And Azerbaijan is not becoming such a Finland. Azerbaijan is solving their problem with bringing, let me remind you, a NATO power. The second largest, actually, NATO army into their territory. So don't even ask me, it's a rhetorical question. So how would the Russian military feel about that? So this is the conflict where, of course, everybody is smiling while keeping very sharp knives behind their backs. This is the conflict where we can only hypothesize what Erdogan's expectations. Moscow obviously is waiting for his collapse on his own. And then they will have to, it's like strategy always, So when something happens, we'll figure out how to react.
I'm going to move away into a domestic one, sort of a short question and answer, and then we'll move to the big question about the Ukraine. It's not particularly well understood, especially from the outside, but this is a rapidly changing country. Leave politics, geopolitics aside. The culture here is changing rapidly. Economy is changing rapidly. And I don't think people recognize it, and down to the issues of labor migration, which are actually both ways now. We have tons of non-Armenians living and working here, and that number is going to continue to grow. What happens in this society? How does the society, how does these kinds of social changes, and one of them is, which is one of the most common ones, it's quite common now in Armenia to have people who are in their 20s make 2, 3, 4, sometimes 10 times more than their parents. And this is a very traditional society. A lot of these norms are changing right in front of our eyes. What effect does this have, one, on the politics of the country and on just the social contract that the country has with itself and has through its traditional culture and all these other matters?
First of all, it's not for the first time that this is happening. That in a fundamental way, we might be returning to the kind of high Soviet society, in the sense that there was a moral order dominated by educated, urban, and outward-looking people, and they were predominantly young. We kind of forget it, that how young were the people in the 1950s, and that generation, 1960s. But that intelligentsia, as they used to call it, people of intelligence, people, that moral order was based on a strong and very militarized state, actually. So they were creating research centers, because the Soviet Union needed research centers for their military. Now we have something quite different, that this is intelligentsia emerging, which is not state dependent, which is very self-reliant, worldly, so mobile, and I have big expectations there. First of all, politically, of course, they're not actually very big as they cannot be very big as a voting bloc. However, the moral order is changing. So the moral order, where the immorality of the late 1990s, it was collapsed. Those who managed to grab a piece of real estate needed to have claws and very ugly faces, in order to keep it. Or actually just ferreted away, leave the country, and that's why, rich people were leaving the country. The key word was offshore zone at the time, because you could not really survive for long. Now, these new generations, they're educated, but they are, as you said, they are wealthy or wealthier than before in legal ways, and they want legal conditions for that. They're creating just by their presence, but also potentially, I think, they're coming into politics. They're going to consolidate this new moral order. This is where diaspora must be coming in, because diaspora, these are the people who are naturally close to diaspora. This is where the difference between diaspora, because diaspora was concentrated in the late 20th century mostly in developed and richer countries, especially with the demise of the Lebanon. So it was in California, and California was a much richer place, simply, than Armenia. So if Armenia is becoming, even moderately rich, and should I say, this country is not really Middle Eastern country. It's Southern European. Yeah. So then the differential is much less. There is somewhere to come in, and there is a place to return. So this is another research question. Let's have a think tank and let's study, because this is important. We are now hypothesizing. We are brainstorming. I want to see systematically collected data.
That's a very good answer. I'm going to move on to Ukraine. And the reason, even though it's far from us, it really isn't far from us. And it's actually the issue of the day. And I think people are not understanding how close we are to having a complete catastrophic confrontation in Ukraine. It might be on different levels, but it's well within possibilities that we could be having some kind of a war at that border. I'm not going to go into too much of the details what brought us here, because there's the Western view, and then there's the Russian view of the particular grievances, especially in regards to NATO expansion and promises that were made in 1989 and all the rest of it. That's ancient history. But as far as today's moment, what is the likelihood of war breaking out there? And what is the likely impact that war will have on us, considering that it is very much in Armenia's interest? The less tensions between Russia and the West, the better off we are. That is a very consistent thing. And the more tension there is, the worse off we are. And a war, by its essence, is going to be the worst, the worst manifestation of that. What do you see happening, and how do you see what happening affects us if there is a war or if there is not a war?
This is, again, something which is missing almost entirely from Armenian and Armenian diaspora discourse. What is happening in the greater former Soviet zone? Because Armenia is part of that, because there are important parallels there. How often do you hear anybody, discussing Ukraine or Kyrgyzstan in Armenia? Never. What even would you recommend to people to read? So you hear that there is Mr. Orban in Hungary. How did he come to power? How did he consolidate it? What would you read? Is it common knowledge? Because there are countries, which we watch, because politics we watch, and that's mostly very big countries. That's America, maybe China, but Poland. It's not a small country, but Lithuania, it might be actually very, very important. And that probably explains the timing of last year's attack by Azerbaijan and Turkey. Because it was, let me remind you, there were three key words: COVID, Brexit, Trump. Fall 2020. So everybody was distracted. But for Moscow, it was also Belarus. There was an election in Belarus, which suddenly, the president for life, Lukashenko, seemingly lost. And the way, to enforce himself back on his own society was extremely brutal. even the Russians seem baffled, that they have beaten with truncheons, thousands and thousands of protesters in the street. And second, it was Ukraine, where actually, I think the third revolution succeeded, that they time and again, Ukrainians overthrow their governments. In that respect, they have something in common probably with Armenians. And Mr. Zelensky, let me remind you, was a TV comedian.
Sounds familiar. Some city's mayor, I think.
Exactly, so how many times did this happen? He comes to power, well, think of Italy, in France, actually, there were precedents, when people, who were TV personalities in the United States, for that matter, was it not, who come to power. Now, Russia was very suspicious of Mr. Pashinyan, for the reasons, that are all, well, too obvious, how suspicious they would be of Mr. Zelensky in Ukraine. And in Ukraine, it's here, it's a very strange situation that Ukraine is pro-democracy and pro-Western. Russia is conservative and insular. In our part of the world, it's Armenia, which is pro-democracy and pro-Western, but it's also pro-Russian. While Azerbaijan, which is definitely not pro-Western, and they don't even claim, to be pro-democracy. What is the official phrase? The values of continuity and permanence, rather, in a presidential monarchy, like Azerbaijani regime, are at the forefront. However, in Ukraine, there are all the ingredients for a world war. That's what is so frightening. This is how, let me remind you, that world wars happen over such small trifle things like Sarajevo, Danzig, or maybe Karabakh, or maybe Donbass. You start looking, in the beginning, everybody looks on the map, where on earth is Trieste, so why is it claimed or Fiume, by so many guys, Jerusalem, we heard about it, but does it exist in reality? Where is it located, so this is, you're right, very complex. This is something that needs a lot of our attention. And this is, back to your question about what happens in 4 years between Russia, Azerbaijan, and a lot will be answered by the outcome of this current crisis right now. We just don't know. Everybody is guessing, so something has happened. We realize something happened, probably intelligence reports, something we don't know what happened. Russians get very worried for whatever reason. President Putin decided to go with essentially an ultimatum that is extremely unlikely to get a positive response, let alone that it was sent through the internet, to the West. This is not how diplomacy is conducted traditionally. Did he ever expect an answer? So if he didn't expect an answer, so could it be the cover for something else which is coming? So we are holding our breath. And I had a friend of mine, who was a woman, police officer, state trooper in New York, very Irish lady, who said that this is the moment when I just say, let's pray.
Well, thank you for joining us, Professor. It's a pleasure to have you. And we'll have you back again next year.
Let me finish on this, that I told you, that we have to maintain the traditions and normalcy of life. I'm complicit in that. All this summer I was making cherry wine using Armenian cherries and Armenian mehr, honey.
Well, and
I cannot give CivilNet a new car. I know that you need a new car. I hope that somebody watching us will help with that.
Well, the only thing I'm concerned, my only regret is that all the people watching the show will not be able to join us in having this Vishnovka, which is, I've had it before, it's fantastic. Thank you for your gift. Thank you for joining us. And thank you for joining us for this year-end review with Professor Derlugian. This is your host, Eric Hacopian.